Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session C2. We will be getting started in just a few minutes. Hi, Stacy. Hi, Erin. Do you all have everything you need?
Hello. Yes, I think we're all set. And let me just exit full screen mode. Um, I will share my screen as well and control the slides.
Okay.
Stacy, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing very well. It's been an exciting morning so far.
Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. We're right at 11:30. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session C2, which will run from 11:30 to 12:15 p.m. I am Tabitha Samuel. I'm the digital archivist of the Waring Historical Library, as well as the second year director of SCAA. And it is my pleasure to be one of the moderators of this session. And so in this session, we have Stacy Moore and Erin Allsop from Central Piedmont Community College, who will be talking about advancing diversity through archival instruction. We have a few logistics to cover before we start our session. And here's our meeting information. So this is a recorded session, as you all know. You were prompted before you entered. So you can enter and leave and switch sessions at any time. There's another concurrent session happening at this time. Please stay muted and with your video off. There will be a 15-minute break between all the sessions, but after this particular session, we will have a lunch break. And for those of you who will be attending the business meetings, so you'll have a 30-minute block, and then the business meeting will start at 12:45 p.m. And the link to that meeting was sent out to our members. So if you are a member and you have not received that link, please feel free to contact me and I will send that to you. The questions if you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave those for Erin and Stacy in the chat. And so we'll have a Q&A period after their presentation to go through your questions and comments. So I will stop sharing my screen, and Erin and Stacy, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Just give me one moment as I share my screen. Oh, it is disabled actually. Let's see.
1 second. I believe I can make you a co-host.
Okay, no problem. Wait, yeah, I think, yep, we got it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, good now. All right, can everyone see this okay?
Yes.
Presentation mode. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well today. I am Erin Allsop. I'm the archivist for Central Piedmont Community College in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is just right over the York County, South Carolina border.
And my name is Stacy Moore. I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities at Central Piedmont, but they also still let me teach a little bit. So really, I'm here today in the capacity as a history instructor who's had the great opportunity to work with Erin and her group on this, what we think is a really interesting project.
Yes, it has been interesting. And today we'll kind of cover our processes as well as, oops, sorry, the little icon button isn't working here. Hold on, let's see. There we go. So the outcomes of today's session, as I was saying, participants will learn how archival and primary source materials can be used to discuss information literacy, how using these sources incorporates more diverse and equitable viewpoints into lessons. We'll also discuss some specific activities as well as ideas for activities that incorporate archival materials into instruction for not just history, but also things that could be applied to different types of courses. And then lastly, we'll just touch on some digitally accessible repositories and the types of materials that they collect. So to begin, I know for those who weren't in the keynote session this morning for Jermaine Fowler, there was a lot of things that he touched upon. And one takeaway that I got was a quote that he had shared on his website. And just as some food for thought, you know, he says, "Every day I dig into the archives of humanity to uncover wisdom, truth, and untold stories." So the picture of the three gentlemen that you see below is really from my own personal perspective. So when I was in school, you know, there was obviously various lessons in history that we learned about, you know, American history, world history. And then the one thing that always kind of struck with me was, you know, the race for, you know, electrical innovation, especially at the turn of the century, right? We always learned about Thomas Edison and how he invented the light bulb and things of that nature. But really only a paragraph mentioned a man named Nikola Tesla. And really there was no mention of Lewis Latimer. I didn't learn about Tesla or Latimer until much later in life. And for those who aren't aware, obviously Thomas Edison is, you know, known for inventing the light bulb, but it really was Lewis Latimer who who perfected the filament that would make light bulbs last longer. And why was there no mention of this man? Or at least if there was mention, you really had to go digging for it. right? But then lastly, with Tesla, he was really he perfected the way on how to harness electricity. So without this way to harness electricity, the light bulbs wouldn't work, right? So just thinking of that and putting that in perspective, looking at this image here, I thought this was really striking. It's labeled as the Edison Pioneers in 1918. And at the foreground of the photo, you see Lewis Latimer sitting in the front, the only African-American man as part of the whole Edison Pioneers. And to not go too much into the whole Tesla, Edison, Latimer, timeline here, Tesla at this point was not affiliated with Edison, and that's why he's not included in this photo. He was kind of written off and, put into obscurity at this point. But it seems, at least in some respect, that Latimer was well received, although, albeit he had to, make a way for himself and carve his own path. And then lastly, I thought this was funny, a character of Tesla and Edison by Emin Taxas. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, but, the idea of, history continuously focusing on the perspective of one or a singular viewpoint, as opposed to the viewpoints or the perspectives of all. So we're going to open this up to the chat, and we want to hear from you. Do you believe most textbooks and sometimes instructional sessions, do they generally focus on one perspective rather than include all perspectives? And if so, if you think that, could archival sources and collections help to change that? And then as a follow-up, have any of you considered incorporating archival collections into your lessons? Why or why not? So unfortunately, I can't see the chat. I did not prepare that well. So Stacy or Tabitha, if you see any of the questions come through, please just let me know.
I can see the chat.
Okay.
Okay, and I can help out too as answers start to trickle in.
Okay. So we don't need to spend too much time sitting on this screen in particular, but even if you have an idea or something comes up later in our presentation, please just pop it into the chat.
And I'll chime in here just as we're waiting on some stuff to come in and say that, as a history instructor, when you look at textbooks, there does seem to be this historical canon that all textbook publishers, there are certain things that you have to include, which means there are certain things that have to be taken out, right? But I think over time, our perspectives on equity, diversity, and inclusion today are much different than they were even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But the same information keeps being duplicated in these textbooks, and marginalized groups or minoritized groups are oftentimes continuously left out. So I think, allowing for that exploration within the archives can reveal some of these things like, like with the invention of the light bulb, like Erin was talking about, players that were significant, but have sort of been written out of the historical record.
I can forward the slide too, if that will be helpful. So just jumping into how Stacy and I started this collaboration, it really began as an idea to incorporate, archival sources, or at least just the process and the instruction behind how to access archival collections and incorporating that into history courses. And it's through this collaboration that we hope to expand this to non-history courses as a way to make it relatable. But another thing that we wanted to have faculty, get on board with was incorporating archive sources for primary resource requirements. So, the value and the understanding of how to use and interpret archival records as a way to have a better understanding of the context of certain events and viewpoints. This was also another opportunity to prepare students for more detailed research levels, becoming more familiar with how archival collections are organized, but also how they're accessed and how to incorporate them into their research assignments. So thinking more about not, more than just what archives are, but about also the value that these voices can provide in a larger conversation. So, as Stacy had mentioned, the marginalized groups and voices that normally are left out of the textbook, if they're not represented here, are they perhaps represented, say, in an archival collection or an institution that may host or house some materials that can provide a different viewpoint and a different interpretation of history? So this was really our charge to introduce to students not just a different way of thinking and conducting research, but also making research more approachable by including archival sources and tying into that emotional level of interpreting the past.
So I would, Erin, can you go back real quick?
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's
No
all right.
problem.
I was gonna say that this really was for the class that I'm teaching this semester. It's an American History 1 course, right? So, and I don't know how much you guys know about Central Piedmont Community College, but we've only been in existence since 1963. So the archive collection that Erin has, this is, the materials there are not really in alignment with what we're talking about in class. So, again, this was me as a history teacher wanting to do this, but also as the dean of one of the largest academic areas in the college. I wanted to try to promote this idea of this type of, analytical approach to education, right? So we really did approach it very much as a not around the content, but around the practice, right? Of how do you do this? How do you do research? What's an archive? What does an archivist do? Right. So we were able to look at some materials that really would have been more in alignment with the second half of American history. But we looked at it. We looked at these materials, learned how to approach it, and then my students are applying this to this American History 1 course. All right, I think I'm ready to go to the next one now. Thanks, Erin.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so culturally relevant pedagogy. So one of the things at the community college and this is community colleges around the nation actually are going to this guided pathways framework. And within the guided pathways, there are 4 components, right? So there's clarifying the path, helping students enter the path, and then helping students stay on the path for get into classes they need to transfer or to get into a job or whatever. The 4th pillar of that guided pathways framework is actually ensure students are learning, which you would think in a institution of higher education, that would be first and foremost, right? But that 4th pillar is something that doesn't always get the attention that I believe it should get. Maybe the assumption that it's being done, but this is something that recently I read an article from SCAA, which is the Center for Community College Student Engagement, that dealt with the guided pathways framework. And within that guidebook, there was a policy brief that talked some about culturally relevant pedagogy. And I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about what that is on the next slide. But one of the reasons this is so important is because while our student body has become more and more diverse over the years, our faculty has become less and less diverse. So you're talking about 45% of our students are from minoritized groups, but 70-some% of our faculty is white, right? So not to say that this is going to absolutely prevent this idea of presenting culturally relevant pedagogy, but, and I'm just going to read you a little piece out of this framework, talking about this difference, this gulf between faculty and students. Racially minoritized groups are expected to cross cultural borders daily with instructors who do not acknowledge or understand their cultural specificity. So, and this is not everybody, but basically this idea of white privilege, or maybe not admitting to this idea of white privilege. But in this policy brief, they talk about faculty needing to be more thoughtful about pedagogy and methods to further encourage fostering critical practice and culturally relevant pedagogies to promote critically criticality, community building, and sharing cultural capital. So if we go to the next slide, I sort of wanted to get a little more input. Now, Gloria Ladson Billings is really the preeminent scholar on this topic of culturally relevant pedagogy. And she says that this is a theoretical model that not only addresses student achievement, but also helps students to accept and affirm their cultural identity while developing critical perspectives that challenge inequities that schools and other institutions are perpetuate. Now, culturally relevant pedagogy has been around for a while. You can see this was from 1995, but oftentimes this is applied to K-12 education, right? So I was really happy as someone that had a foot in both of those worlds. I was happy to see this culturally relevant pedagogy argument being presented at the post-secondary level as well. So that's sort of the textbook definition of culturally relevant pedagogy. But I was wondering if in the chat, some of you could let me know what you think cultural relevant pedagogy would be, or maybe how this could be approached in a classroom.
Shamila mentions also check out the Ladson Billings I'm Here for the Hard Reset, which is also very relevant to this topic.
Thanks, Shamila.
Does anyone else have any perspective on what they believe that cultural relevant pedagogy would be? And how it would be helpful?
We can.
So again, before we move on, I guess I would say, oh, Erin, will you getting ready to say something?
Oh, all I was going to say was people can mull it over as we present, but I heard Tabitha start to speak as well.
Yeah, I was about to say that this and just in what you were saying here, it I hope would help break down the barrier that exists between instructors and students, and being able to make history resemble more of who the students identify as, and bringing out those unheard stories that we've been talking about. And it plays into that of, if you don't really see yourself in history, you kind of don't really see where you fit in, and you don't really see how the lesson can be relevant to you. And I feel in my work with the South Carolina History Day competition, I get to engage with students who are really enthusiastic about history. But the important part that we try to do is to expose them to all histories, and to expose them to a diverse set of institutions who house archives and primary sources, so that they're not just hearing just one side. And so I think that's a way of reaching them and being able to engage them with history, and to start early on with being able to have this enthusiasm for history. So I think that's very important. Shamila has also left another comment, and she says, using other primary sources, those not normally amplified, which is exactly right.
Yeah, and I think both of those are spot on. This idea of students being able to see themselves in the curriculum is so important. I mean, even if, and I've worked with other teachers before, and there's always some pushback, because, people feel like there's certain things that need to be, covered in their classroom. And, that story is not as inclusive as it should be, right? So what I like about this project that Erin and I have been working on is it has allowed me to do some of the more traditional canon type history in class. And through the archives, the students have been able to explore some areas that are really important and things that they can connect to personally, right? So they can see themselves, whether it's, if they want to find out more about, early Asian influence in early America, or, dig deeper into the issue of the struggle for women's rights, things like that. They are able to do that and not just do it through a textbook that still does not give enough information on these things, but do it in an archives where they can look at these materials and make some judgments for themselves.
Yes, and just as a follow-up to that, and forgive me for not including the links in our presentation, I'll make sure we get that out to everyone today. But one thing, because as Stacy had mentioned, the archives of CPCC doesn't really pertain to early American history or world civ or any other type of history class, or even non-history classes that we may offer. But one approach that we had taken was the creation of LibGuides, and the creation specifically of primary source guides that incorporate other types of archival collections that feature the hidden voices, quote unquote, and providing access to students through that way, because LibGuides are something that at least most of our students are very used to seeing and accessing. So giving them the opportunity to explore on their own in a format that they're somewhat familiar with, to make it more approachable and more easily understood. So just an overview of some current instruction practices, and we do have another colleague who is not with us today. He had a scheduling conflict, but he is also a part of this team. His name is Garrison Libby, and he's the head of instruction services for Central Piedmont Community College Libraries. And just so some overview that and points that he's outlined for us to share. We want to get students critically thinking about information, and a lot of our students don't have the experience with not just how to research, but how to even navigate a database. This is a first for many. And so what he says is like a tug of war between information literacy, so understanding the information, but also how to understand how to navigate and access these sources. So it's always a fine line that we walk, and but that's okay, because it's always a learning practice for us as well. And then making the most of these 50-minute sessions or a virtual session as well. And then lastly, he touches upon the incorporation of the ACRL framework, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So thinking of that, the ACRL framework, really, if we want students to understand the information, or what he says to be information literate, we need them to be able to engage with a wide variety of sources. So stepping out of the peer-reviewed journal articles and, to the actual journal entries that perhaps this peer-reviewed body is referencing in their works, right? So some points of the ACRL framework, authority is constructed and contextual. So as I had mentioned, thinking beyond that peer-reviewed journal article. Information has value. So whose voices are included in the conversation and whose are left out? And then if, for those who are left out of the conversation, where can we find those voices? How do we navigate those systems on, and how to access those voices? And, a lot of the times too, this information isn't digitized or isn't made accessible through virtual or digital platforms. So what can we do as archivists and educators and preservers of history to make sure that these voices can continuously be accessed and preserved over time? But then lastly, scholarship is conversation. So where should we look for these conversations? Do we just stick with a traditional library database or an archival collection, or can we go out to museums? Can we go out to historical societies and the non-traditional sources of information? But again, making that more accepted in the wider, as Stacy had mentioned, the canon of the educational process, and making this a more dynamic and inclusive practice. Stacy, did you want to talk about this one? I forget. Oh no, we can talk about this. So
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
When I was just gonna, you can start us off. I was gonna walk them through some of the steps of this, what we did with the class. So
okay,
if you want to get us started though.
Sounds good. So so at the start of this session, it was just one in-person session that we had in early August or late August, forgive me. And the start of the session was really about how to navigate these databases. So we instructed the students to find a primary source and a secondary source online. more or less on the same topic of their choice. And then they would have to compare and contrast these sources and give a more verbal explanation of the understanding of this change over time. And then the second part was a visit to the archives. So, the first part, where they had done this online searching and sort of this mental interpretation of the compare and contrast view, we kind of applied that same practice into this archives visit, and we used our college publications collection, which for the most part, it covers the time frame of 1960 to 1980 or 90. And we instructed the students to find perspectives on local, national, and international events. I know many of pretty much all the people on this call, aside from Stacy and myself, are aware of actually the information included in these publications. But the students of Central Piedmont at the time, there was a student-led newspaper that they would write about, world events, national events, things that really related to them, not just as students, but as general citizens of the world. So everything from the Vietnam War to women's rights and the ERA to civil rights, things, everything that we learn about in class was referenced or included in some way in these publications. So we thought that while the topics of the publications didn't necessarily relate to early American history, we wanted to give students the exposure and the experience to emotionally connect with a student voice of the past. So using, those two those two lessons, we instructed students to think about how to create an annotated bibliography. So a summary of the source that they found, and analyzing the compare and contrast views reflected in that, but also reflecting on the sources as well. And then lastly, we were hoping to, we didn't do this semester, but we're hoping to actually create a scaffolded assignment next semester. So giving various points to check in with certain assignments. And Stacy will talk about that in just a minute.
So yeah, this was a great experience. We did this. I brought my class into the archives during the second week of class, and this is a night class, so it's a 3-hour class, right? So we have a little bit more time in one big chunk. But during the first night of class, I started, as I usually do, talking about what is history and talking about perspective and sort of setting up this visit to the archives. And it was amazing. This is the first time we'd done this, and it just dovetailed so nicely together what Erin and Garrison kind of picked up with, and walk them through these processes of, there's a multitude of different sources out there, and talking about perspective and voice and point of view and things like that. And then actually, talking with them about what an archive is and what does an archivist do, and then allowing them to actually put their hands on some of these documents. It was a pretty powerful experience. After this, and during this period of time, actually, we talked about the assignment, right? So contextualize, why is this important? We believe it's got a bigger importance, right? But for the class, they had to do this assignment. So they picked 5 sources, some primary, some secondary. They are supposed to give a summary of each, right? And then there's a reflection piece that talks about, how the topic changed over time. Are the sources in agreement? What are the voices that are reflected in what they found? So a real analytical view. Like Erin said, looking back, and this is what happens, when you're in the midst of doing an assignment like this, the thought was, maybe it would have been better if I'd had some turn-in points, like give me your sources, and then give me your summaries, and then later give me your reflection. So that might be something we do in the future. Now, the materials have not come in yet. The due date, we have not arrived at that. So we'll see. Hopefully we'll be pleasantly surprised with this. But, I think that's a big part of any sort of, instructional endeavor like this, is to reflect and try to figure out a way to get better. Now, I will say another part of this collaboration that's been fantastic is that this wasn't a one and done with the archives, right? So both Erin and Garrison are embedded in my Brightspace course, which is the LMS that we use. So periodically, they'll send out updates to the students, sources, databases that they may be able to use. And then a couple of nights ago, Erin actually came by my class and touched base with them on a face-to-face, in a face-to-face environment, which is great. So this is truly a partnership. We feel like it's been a great partnership, and the idea is to scale this up, right? To present this to the folks at our college, and of course in venues like this, to encourage others to do this if it's possible.
Yes, and as a follow-up and just a thought that just popped into my mind, a little bit of perhaps a selfish, hopeful outcome, I think too, is to expose students to the archival profession and to make them aware that this type of profession exists, especially if they have a love of history but don't necessarily want to teach. This is another avenue for them to do so. And by exposing them to other types of collections and voices and opinions and things that, we as archivists have the blessing to interact with and encounter every day and work to preserve. If I can have at least one of Stacy's students be inspired to pursue this profession, I will chalk that up as a win. But obviously that's not the main purpose of it, but something I hope maybe will be an outcome. Okay, so this is, and even though we have two images here, we're just going to verbally talk about some of the outcomes of this analysis assignment. So on the left here is actually a photo that Stacy had taken on his cell phone of some of our publication, some of the cover pages and then some of the articles, but then the article image shown on the right, the title is Helping Boat People Adjust. And for those who are unaware, Central Piedmont, since the early 1970s, through the works of Zilda DePaula, who was in charge of the what was known then as the International Culture Department, we really were and continue to be to this day, a resource for international students, for people, fleeing war-torn regions, war-torn countries. And unfortunately, the phrasing of the article is not appropriate for the time, but a student who actually discovered this article, his family was, Stacy, you can probably talk more about him specifically, but he had an emotional connection with this because his family had fled Southeast Asia. I'm not sure if it was a result of the Vietnam War or something that happened later on, but he resonated with this because his own family, emigrated to the United States, and, we're in situations like this. And for him as a student in 2021, to be able to connect on an emotional level, interpret language used in the past, and develop this, an analytical approach to why certain languages were used, why certain phrases were used, but also the perspective shown and featured in an article like this. That was really the main takeaway, and he understood the assignment without necessarily understanding it at the first place. So I'll pause there and let Stacy talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, it was interesting to see the student make that connection, and I think it's very similar to what Tabitha was talking about. Students being able to see themselves in the historical record. So this student actually is he's an immigrant from Myanmar, so not too far away from this area that was being talked about in this article. But I found it also very interesting because this is a student whose name on the roster and the name that he goes by is different, right? He's taken an American name, an anglicized name, instead of using his official name, which is fine, but it makes me harken back to those words of Gloria Ladson Billings, where she talks about helping students to accept and affirm their cultural identity, right? And so something like this, maybe this is something that's going to go a long way in helping him to affirm that cultural identity.
So this is just an overview of some other types of instructional activities that we have tried to implement, but also just some ideas that we've come up with that haven't yet been implemented. The timeline activity, this was something that Garrison had suggested, and something that actually is recommended and really strongly encouraged. And faculty are actually happy to hear about this as well. So with this timeline activity, we instruct students to pull together multiple sources about a topic, both primary and secondary, as well as tertiary if it works out that way, and then have students arrange them in a timeline. So this helps to further implement the ACRL framework of information creation as a process. So understanding how information is compiled, how, say even in an essay, how you format and have your intro and body paragraphs, your thesis statement, things of that nature. So putting more of a hands-on approach to this information creation process. The second one was, a general versus local. So really to get students thinking about where they might go, either physically or virtually, to connect with the topic, a research topic for local history, but also getting them to think about how different conversations take place and what voices are left out of that scholarly record. So this would touch upon that ACRL framework of searching as strategic exploration. But then, just as a follow-up to that, just some benefits of shaking things up by incorporating archival collections, primary source collections, and other types of resources is that it provides new experiences for students, but also for faculty and staff. But it also exposes students and faculty alike to different perspectives and different types of resources outside of scholarly articles. So this was an activity that we have not incorporated into a class yet, because it actually was, I discovered Docs Teach. For those on the call today who have used Docs Teach, we would welcome any sort of experience and advice that you have had with using this. But for the chat, from a culturally relevant pedagogy standpoint, what are your takeaways from this primary source? Could this be used in classes beyond history? And also, lastly, what types of other materials could you use in your class? So we did provide a link at the start of the chat box, but just to summarize, this is a letter sent to President John F. Kennedy about LGBTQ perspectives, within the civil rights movement. And what is nice about Docs Teach is that it gives students, or it gives the user, the opportunity to analyze a document by selecting what types of sources they think this category is categorized within, whether it's a letter, a promotional material. I don't have it in front of me. I'm not going to exit out of the full screen at this point, but but then it gives students an opportunity to answer who is writing it, who is it being written to, all sorts of things that we've outlined in this annotated bibliography and reflection assignment. So one thing I thought why it was interesting too is because it gets students involved in using primary archival sources without necessarily saying that that's the case, right? It's pretty obvious for all of us too, but for a student who's maybe never accessed something like this before, it presents it in a way that's easily digestible. So we did provide the link here, and I did hyperlink it as well. So if at the end, because I know we're approaching the 12 or almost the 12:15 mark, we could plug through this if it's of interest. Stacy, did you want to add anything about this?
Yeah, just to sort of piggyback on what you said, I think for students who are just being exposed to primary documents, this is a very approachable way. It's really scaffolded, right? So if you look and if you click on the link and look at this, the first step is meet the document. It walks them through the steps, right? So they try to determine what is this? Is it a letter? Is it a telegram? Is it a newspaper? So there are all these things, and you can check multiple boxes, right? And then you're just describing it, right? If you were explaining this to somebody else, how would you explain it? So these are things I think for those of us who've worked extensively with primary documents, you sort of take these steps for granted. But for our new scholars in this area, I think something like this really can be eye-opening for them to start to learn how to actually work with these, the mechanics of what you do with these sources.
And one thing I think is interesting too is that there is a disclaimer included at the very top of the page where it references, and gives a disclaimer about the language used in the source to make the user aware that there could be offensive language that is, included in this source, and you're just making them aware at the beginning. And that is something that I know when the students had come to the archive, that was something that Stacy, myself, and Garrison all said that, through this process, you're learning not just the perspectives of others, but also the language used at the time, and why as a society this needs to change, and having an understanding of what had happened in the past so that we can make sure that things like this never happen again.
And also just the evolution of terminology, right? So we know that terminology does evolve over time. I know one of the things that Erin and I have had this discussion about is the idea of, or the people referring to slaves versus enslaved people, right? Or enslaved people versus slaves. In textbooks, even the textbook that I'm currently using, which is a 2020 edition, the reference is still slaves as opposed to enslaved people. And I talked about this with my class. Actually, I talked about this with my class when Erin was in there the other day. And I said, I think probably in the next edition, that'll be different, right? We have this evolution, how we look at things and also how we talk about things. And it's important to know that the language that was used in the 1950s and 60s that may have been acceptable then, if you're writing about this in a contemporary sense, you need to be aware that you need to use the terminology that's acceptable today, not what was used back in 1960.
Yes. Oh, well, that was actually the second to last slide, so we can open it up for questions. And then, but what I'll do is I will post here's our email addresses if anyone wants to follow up with us, or if they have questions, experience to share, and even resources as well that we're perhaps unaware of that should be incorporated, please just let us know.
Thank you to you both. This was an excellent presentation. I left a comment myself that the Docs Teach tool is an excellent tool for archives that practice outreach to primary and secondary schools to get students acquainted with their primary sources, even if in their own institutions, as far as like a way to analyze the primary sources there. So it's just an excellent tool for bringing the archives out and into to students. So just to start that analysis early on. So, and if anyone has any questions or comments, please leave them in the chat. And thank you, Erin, for the link that is out to what?
Oh, I am explaining that. So these
gotcha.
are, sorry, I should have prefaced it before I started posting. So I mentioned the primary source guides early on in the presentation that we've put together to share with students and with faculty as well, that highlight different perspectives. So the first is primary resources for African American studies. The second is primary resources for Latin American or Latinx studies. And then lastly, it's a guide for primary sources that focus on Native American and Indigenous studies. So each of the guides has tabs on the left-hand side that show a list of archive sources, a list of library databases, as well as citation and research assistance, and some of which will have professional organizations, and some of which I think they all do include it. Forgive me for not, I had them all up. Just give me 1 second. Yeah, so some, like for example, African American studies, we have a tab for social media. So social media platforms that promote African American history, heritage, and voices. This is something that we put together not just to show for students, but also showing faculty that there's a lot of wealth of information and knowledge that can be accessed through non-traditional ways. So like Twitter is a great resource. Granted, I guess maybe 30 years from now, we'll see Twitter referenced a lot more in historical essays, but thinking of the use of social media and born digital records, and understanding the value that they have, but also understanding the sensitive nature that surrounds the preservation of these files, how they can be interpreted, misinterpreted, how they could be, like the deep fakes, that's something that, thinking about, research in the future, how can we be sure that the digital tools that we're accessing now will be easily interpreted, accessed, and understood in the future.
Awesome. Could you both leave your emails in the chat, because we won't have time for questions, but just so that anyone who has any questions can reach out to you directly. And to confirm your presentation, we'll be making that available. We're going to have a folder within Google Drive where we'll be making the recordings and the presentations available. So these slides here, you'll also be able to access. So now we're going to break for lunch. We will start back, we'll have our business meeting starting at 12:45 to 1:30. So our next set of sessions will begin at 1:30. So I want to thank Erin and Stacy for your presentation. I have learned a lot. So we thank you for that. And thank you to everyone for attending. Be well and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care.